Welcome. If you're watching this, you're either preparing for a SWIFT CSP assessment or you've already been through one to make sure the next one goes better. Either way, this is for you. I'm a SWIFT CSP certified assessor. In the next 5 minutes, I'm going to walk you through the 5 areas that actually determine assessment outcomes. Not what organizations think matters, but what assessors are doing in the room. So let's get into it. So here's the setup. When organizations prepare for a SP assessment, they tend to focus on documentation, policies, procedures, attestation language, completed controlled checklists. That work isn't wasted, but it's incomplete. There's a consistent gap between what gets prepared and what assessors actually evaluate. That gap is exactly where most findings come from. A password policy that says 12 characters means nothing if the system is configured for 8. So what assessors are actually asking is a different set of questions entirely. Is that documentation current and accurate? Does your team actually know what it says? Does it match the real system state, not the intended statement? Actual one. Can you produce the evidence quickly? And do the logs exist, and can you get to them? These are real evaluation criteria. Keep them in mind as we go through each area. So the first thing I check before evaluating a single control is whether the architecture type is actually correct. I trace how SWIFT messages move through your environment, including indirect pathways, and compare that to what was submitted. This matters more than most realize. A common finding an institution classifies as type B because they believe their service provider handles everything. But when we look at the environment, there are batch file processes, middleware servers, processing SWIFT messages internally. Under SWIFT version 2026, that's a type A reclassification, and the control scope expands significantly. The fix is straightforward. Confirm your architecture type independently against current CSCF guidance before your assessment starts, not based on what you submitted last year. A consistent source of findings across every assessment is a mismatch between documentation and reality. 3 examples I see repeatedly. First, the password policy specifies complexity requirements, but the system enforces something different. Policy isn't wrong, the system just doesn't match. Second, the network diagram shows a segmented architecture, but the firewall rules contain broad, allow any entries that directly contradict it. Third, the acceptable use policy references the tool that no longer is in use. The current tools aren't mentioned anywhere. The documentation describes an environment that no longer exists. The documentation that doesn't match the actual environment is not evidence of compliance, it's an evidence of a gap. The access control generates findings in 4 specific areas on every assessment. First, the user access list. It needs to be current, complete, and reviewed within the last 90 days. So that includes service accounts, not just human users. If the last review was 14 months ago, that's a finding for Control 5. Second, privilege access. MFA must be enforced for all privilege and remote access without exceptions. Disabled MFA for operational convenience is always a finding. Third, recertification. Policy stating quarterly reviews is not evidence. I want the records, who reviewed them when, what was reviewed, and what was removed or modified. Fourth, terminated users. How quickly is access removed when someone leaves? And is there documented evidence that it happening? So logging gets evaluated across 3 dimensions. First, where are the logs stored? Centralized SIEM or distributed? Second, is there active monitoring? Define review frequency, configured alert thresholds, with evidence that alerts were accidental, not just that the system is running. Third, can you produce specific logs quickly? The most common finding here is that logs exist but aren't actively monitored. There's no defined review frequency, and retention isn't text worsened. So here's a practical test to run before your assessment. Ask someone in your team to pull the logs for a specific user, specific system, in a specific time range, and time how long it takes. If it takes more than 15 minutes, you have an operational gap that will show up during the assessment. Third-party governance is consistently one of the largest gaps between what institutions believe and what evidence shows. There are rechecks. First, can you list every provider that supports, hosts, and interacts with your SWIFT environment? MSPs, cloud providers, service bureaus, middleware vendors, a complete inventory. Most institutions can name 1 or 2, so that's not sufficient. Second, for each provider, do you have a SOC ISO 27001 certification or equivalent evidence covering the specific CS controls they're responsible for? A general security certification is not enough. Third, customer responsibility metrics. When I compare it against the system security policy in actual practice, I frequently find that the institution has documented patch management while relying entirely on an MSP with no formal arrangement in place. So my provider handles that. It requires a documented evidence that they actually do it. So you remain accountable for every control in your scope, regardless of who implements it. So here's what I recommend doing this week. So run a documentation versus reality check on top 3 controls. So start with assessment findings. So if you don't have any, default to access control 5.1, password policy 4.1, and logging 6.1. Pull the policy procedure for each, then pull the actual system configuration or operational evidence. Ask yourself, do they match exactly? Not approximately. Every mismatch you find, document it, assign an owner, and set a remediation. That list becomes your immediate action plan. Most organizations already have the controls in place. The gap is between the documentation and the operational reality. So finding that gap yourself before an assessor does is the highest value thing you can do to prepare. So to recap the 5 areas: architecture, confirm it independently against your CSCF guidance before your assessment. Documentation versus actual state. The most common source of findings. Policies must match configurations. Configurations must match your actual environment. Access control and privilege access. Current user lists. Complete service account inventories. MFA without exception. Documented evidence and periodic review. Logging and monitoring. Active review. Configure thresholds and the ability to produce log evidence within minutes. And third-party governance. Complete provider inventory. Relevant due diligence documentation, and a customer responsibility matrix that reflects what actually happens operationally. So that's the 5-minute version, actually closer to 9 minutes. Full webinar goes deeper on all 5 areas. Real assessment examples for each, specific evidence requests assessors make, the findings language we use, and the practical tips to actually move the needle before attestation. It also covers what's changed in CSCF version 2026 and what that means for your scope. If you're preparing for an upcoming assessment, I encourage you to watch it. And if you're ongoing insights on AI governance and cybersecurity products, subscribe at elevateconsult.com. Thanks for your time today.